Algebra 2 students, welcome to your notes on 5.5, factoring by grouping. And right off the bat, I'm going to have you guys make a change on your notes because really what we're factoring today is not trinomials. We're going to factor polynomials. And so you can cross off that factor trinomials by grouping. It should say polynomials. And so, yeah, there you go. We have a mistake right at the beginning. All right, so some of you will probably remember that when we factored by using the AC method, that after we started breaking down our trinomial, we would end up with a polynomial that had multiple terms to it, and we would then factor by grouping. Some of you might be sitting there wondering what in the world I'm talking about, but you'll probably remember when I start putting parentheses on this expression. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down this polynomial into smaller parts that I can actually deal with. And so I'm going to set up some parentheses like this. And when I do that, I'm going to then start to factor these terms over here. So I look for the greatest common factor that I can pull out of this left-hand side here. So the greatest common factor that I can pull out of that left-hand side would be 2p squared. When I pull 2p squared, or when I factor 2p squared out of both of those terms, I end up with a p plus 8 divided by 2 would be 4. P squared divided by p squared would just be 1, so I end up with p plus 4. On this right-hand side, I've got I can factor a 3 out, and so it's important that I put a plus 3 there. You need to indicate whether it is a positive or negative 3 that you are factoring out. And when I do that, I end up with a p plus 4 left over inside of my parentheses. Now, you probably remember from factoring by using the AC method that this right here needs to match this right here. If it doesn't, you are not heading down the right track. And so when you are getting to this point, you need to kind of double check that and make sure everything's looking nicely. In other words, you want to have that set of parentheses match that set of parentheses, because now we are doing the distributive property but backwards. So I have 2p squared plus 3 inside of a set of parentheses, and I have p plus 4 inside of a set of parentheses. I do need to remember that I need to double check this to see if anything else is factorable further. If something is factorable further, then I need to go ahead and factor that out as well. Done with that one. Okay, on to number 2. So I'm going to again set up my parentheses so that I can focus on one section at a time. I can factor a p squared out of that left-hand side, which gives me a p minus 3 left over. I can factor a positive 4 out of that right-hand side, which gives me a p minus 3 left over. I can do the distributive property, but backwards. So I've got p squared plus 4 inside of a set of parentheses, and I've got p minus 3 inside of another set of parentheses. Now, what some students I think confuse when we have to factor further, some students I think confuse this piece here as a difference of squares. This can't be factored any further. If this was a minus sign, however, then that would be a difference of squares, and then it would be p minus 2 multiplied by p plus 2, but we don't have a subtraction sign right there. So, we're simply done. All right, on example number 3, I'm going to kind of do something a little different than I had on the previous couple of examples. So when I set up my parentheses, I'm going to put them there and there. I want to include that negative in front of the x. And then so that I don't change my equation, I need to put a plus sign in between those two. If I don't have that plus sign in between those two, I have completely changed my problem, and now I have multiplication going on, and I don't have that. So anyways, this positive sign is important. Now I can factor this left-hand side, so I will have x squared. My leftovers will be x plus 2. And when I factor out this right-hand side, I'm going to factor out a negative 1 And when I do that, I end up with an x plus 2 as well. Now, if you factor that right-hand side and you forgot to factor out the negative and you just did a positive one, you might end up with a set of parentheses that doesn't match. That would be one of those indicators where you would say, hey, I've got something wrong. I need to go back and look at this. Okay, so now we just have the distributive property but backwards, so I'm going to combine x squared minus 1 inside of a set of parentheses, and I'm going to go ahead and combine my x plus 2 inside of another set of parentheses. That is a parentheses. And I can actually factor further this side right here. I can factor that further. So what I need to do, this is a difference of squares. This would be x plus 1 multiplied by x minus 1. Okay, and then x plus 2 is still sitting there. So really all I've done is taken that x squared minus 1. That's a difference of squares. I can factor that further. All right, so for example number 4, I'm going to set up my parentheses. I've got a positive sign in between that 7x, so I can just kind of leave that positive sign sitting there. I'm going to factor an x squared out of this left-hand side, and when I do that, I end up with a 7x plus 6. I'm going to factor a positive 1 out of this right-hand side. I can pull a positive 1 out about anything, and I end up with my 7x plus 6 over there as well. So my final answer would be x squared plus 1 inside of parentheses multiplied by 7x plus 6 inside of another set of parentheses. I don't see how to factor that any further. So we would be done with that one. Okay, our last problem is number 5. So I'm going to, again, I'm setting up parentheses. I am breaking this up into smaller sections that I can deal with. On this left-hand side over here, I'm going to factor out a 6x squared. When I do that, I end up with an x plus 2 left over. On this right-hand side, I can factor out, let's see, I can factor out an 18 out of both of those numbers. When I factor that 18 out, I end up with x plus 2 as well. So now, let's change colors here. I've got 6x squared plus 18 multiplied by x plus 2. Okay, so what you would do is every time you're done, you need to ask yourself, can I factor this any further? And in this particular case, I can factor a 6 out of that term and a 6 out of that term. Okay, so when I do that, I end up with a 6 hanging out front. And then when I factor that out, I've got x squared plus 3 multiplied by x plus 2. Okay, and I know that some of you are probably sitting there thinking, well, why didn't you just factor out that 6 right off of the bat? When I was, let's change that laser pointer, when I was up here at this line, okay, I could have looked at all of these terms and said, hey, I can factor a 6 out of every single one of those. Wouldn't that make my life easier? Yes, it could be done that way. You do need to remember to put this 6 out front the entire time on each piece of work as you're going down if you end up factoring using that method. So that's totally fine.